Chapter 1. She arrived just as the last light of day was being swallowed by the evening. The sky stretched thin and weary like a bruise that had been pressed too many times, and the road behind her seemed to sigh with relief as her feet finally stopped moving, because she had been walking for so long that even the idea of standing still felt unfamiliar. The inn stood quietly at the edge of the town, its wooden sign creaking gently in the wind as if it were trying to whisper a warning or a welcome, and when she pushed open the door, the small bell above it rang with a fragile sound, the kind that suggested it had rung fewer times with every passing year. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, boiled tea, and something else, something warm and human. And behind the counter stood the innkeeper, a poor man by every visible measure, his coat worn thin at the elbows, his hands rough from years of work that never seemed to pay enough, and his eyes tired but not unkind. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because sometimes silence carries more truth than words, and then she asked the question she had been carrying like a stone in her chest: where would I sleep tonight? Her voice steady only because it had learned how to survive disappointment. The innkeeper did not answer immediately, not because he did not want to help, but because he knew the weight of that question, knew what it meant to ask it, knew that asking meant you had already run out of better options, and as he looked at her, her dusty shoes, her trembling hands, the quiet dignity she still tried to hold onto, memories rose uninvited, memories of his own nights of hunger, of loss, of standing in rooms where hope felt like an intruder. He finally nodded and told her there was one room left, small and cold, and she nodded back as if she had already accepted worse, following him down a narrow hallway where the walls bore scratches from years of passing lives, each mark a story that no one stayed long enough to finish. When he opened the door to the room, the light revealed a simple bed, an old chair, and a thin blanket folded carefully at the foot, and as she stepped inside, he walked to the bed and pulled the blanket back. Not roughly, not hurriedly, but gently, revealing clean sheets beneath, neatly tucked, freshly aired, and something about that single act, that quiet respect, shattered the invisible armor she had built around herself. She stood frozen, because no one had prepared a bed for her in a very long time, no one had expected her arrival with intention, and when he told her she could stay without payment for the night, that she could rest first and worry later, her throat tightened so suddenly she could barely breathe. She asked him why, because pain often demands an explanation for kindness, and he simply said, because everyone deserves a place to sleep without fear, and then he left her alone, closing the door softly as if afraid of disturbing not just her rest, but her dignity. That night, as she lay beneath the blanket, the fabric warm against her skin, she stared at the ceiling while memories poured in like rain through a broken roof. Nights spent awake on hard benches, the sound of footsteps passing without stopping, the humiliation of asking for help and being told tomorrow, always tomorrow, and yet here, in the poorest inn she had ever seen, she felt safer than she had felt in years. Down the hall, the innkeeper sat alone at the counter, running his fingers along the edge of an old ledger he barely used anymore, thinking about the promise he had made to himself long ago, after his life collapsed quietly and without apology, that if he could not be rich in money, he would be rich in mercy. And as the night deepened, neither of them knew that this single moment, this question, this blanket, this choice, was the beginning of a story that would change them both forever. And if you are feeling the weight of this moment already, remember to subscribe to the channel, because stories like this remind us that even the smallest acts of kindness can rewrite a life. Chapter 2. Morning did not arrive loudly, it did not announce itself with urgency or demand attention, but instead slipped quietly into the room the way mercy often does, through a thin crack in the curtains, laying a soft ribbon of pale light across her face, and when her eyes opened she did not jolt upright in panic as she had trained herself to do for years. She did not immediately calculate exits or count her belongings or brace herself for being told to move along, because for the first time in a long time the question of survival did not rush to meet her at the edge of consciousness. She lay still, listening, half expecting the familiar sounds of danger, but all she heard was the low murmur of the inn waking up, the creak of wood settling, the faint clink of a cup somewhere down the hall, and it took several long breaths before she understood that she was safe, that the blanket covering her was still warm, that no one had come in the night to tell her she did not belong. Slowly she sat up, her feet touching the floor with care, as if the moment might break if she moved too quickly, and when she opened the door and stepped into the hallway, she saw the innkeeper standing behind the counter, already awake, already working, wiping the surface with the same quiet patience he had shown when he pulled back the blanket the night before. He looked up and smiled, not wide or dramatic, but real, and he asked her simply if she had slept, and something about the normality of the question nearly undid her, because it assumed she would have slept, assumed she deserved rest, and she answered honestly, saying she had slept well, better than she could remember, and he nodded as if that was exactly what he had hoped for. He offered her tea and bread, nothing fancy, just warm and enough, and as they sat at the small table near the window, the morning light catching dust in the air like floating embers, she began to speak, not all at once, not in a neat timeline, but in fragments the way pain usually escapes. She spoke of a job that disappeared when the company closed without warning, of rent she could not keep up with, of friends who meant well but grew uncomfortable with her need, of nights when she told herself she would only sleep outside once, and then once became many. The innkeeper did not interrupt, did not rush her, did not offer solutions wrapped in false optimism. He only listened, his eyes steady, his hands folded around his cup, and when she paused, unsure whether she had said too much, he shared his own story, not to compare suffering, but to connect it. He told her how the inn once stood on a busy road, how laughter used to spill from its rooms, how his children used to run the halls, until a fire in another town rerouted the road, cutting the flow of travelers overnight, how debts grew, how his wife left for a better life she could no longer see with him, how the building remained while everything else fell away. He told her there were nights he slept behind the counter because heating the rooms cost too much, nights he wondered whether kindness was a luxury he could no longer afford, and yet, every time someone asked where they would sleep, he remembered what it felt like to be unseen, and he chose again to open the door. Something settled between them then, a quiet understanding that life had broken them in similar places but had not managed to hollow them out completely, and when he offered her the chance to stay a little longer, to help with cleaning and cooking in exchange for a room and meals, she accepted without hesitation, not because it was perfect, but because it was dignified, because it allowed her to contribute rather than beg. Days passed, then weeks, marked not by grand events but by small victories. The first morning she laughed without forcing it, the first traveler she welcomed with confidence, the first coin she earned and saved. She learned the rhythms of the inn, the way the floors complained near the stairs, the exact amount of tea leaves needed to make the pot just right, the satisfaction of pulling back fresh blankets for weary guests and seeing relief bloom on their faces the way it once had on hers. Word began to spread slowly, carried not by advertisements but by people, by travelers who said there was an inn where no one looked down on you, where you were treated like a person before a customer, and rooms that once sat empty began to fill, not all at once, but enough to matter. She changed too, in ways she barely noticed at first. Her shoulders lifted, her voice grew stronger, her eyes began to look forward instead of constantly scanning for loss. And one evening, as she and the innkeeper stood side by side preparing a room, smoothing sheets, pulling back a blanket with the same care he had shown her that first night, she realized something profound had happened, that her life had not changed because someone rescued her or handed her an easy ending, but because someone believed she was worth preparing a bed for, worth listening to, worth trusting. When the time came for her to leave months later, it was not because she was being pushed out, but because she was ready to step forward, carrying savings, confidence, and a sense of belonging she had rebuilt from the ground up. And as she stood at the door with her bag, no longer worn, now filled with purpose, the innkeeper wished her well without sadness, because he knew she would carry the kindness forward. Long after she walked down the road toward her future, travelers would still come to the inn and feel something they could not name, a warmth that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with being seen, and all of it began with a single question and a man who chose compassion when he had every reason not to. If this story touched your heart, inspired you, or reminded you of the quiet power of kindness, subscribe to the channel, because the stories you find here are meant to stay with you long after the screen goes dark.